Back in May, when Sinn Féin replaced the DUP as the largest party in the Stormont Assembly. The current Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, has said that if there is no breakthrough, no restoration of power sharing by Friday, and that certainly seems very unlikely to say the least, he will, he says, go ahead and call a fresh election to the Stormont Assembly to be held probably on the 15th of December. So obviously if there is a cabinet reshuffle in the coming days, well, the question is, will Chris Heaton-Harris still remain in post as Northern Ireland Secretary? Would any successor take the same tack as him? Though worth pointing out that this morning the junior minister at the Northern Ireland office, Steve Baker, said that no matter what the events were in Westminster, the government would still go ahead and call that election to the Northern Ireland Assembly on Friday.
OK, Chris Page, thank you very much indeed, and thanks too to James Shaw in Glasgow and Hal Griffith in Cardiff. Well, let's just bring you that moment again a few minutes ago when we heard from the chairman of the 1922 Committee of Conservative Backbenchers, Sir Graham Brady, with the announcement that Rishi Sunak is the new leader of the Conservative Party and Britain's next Prime Minister.
Good afternoon. As returning officer in the leadership election, I can confirm that we have received one valid nomination. And Rishi Sunak is therefore elected as leader of the Conservative Party.
Sir Graham Brady there of the 1922 Committee, and Rishi Sunak is going to be addressing them, we gather, at 2:30. Let's go back to our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young in Downing Street. One valid nomination, as Sir Graham said, but I mean, yesterday, three were in that race. Boris Johnson dropped out last night, then Penny Mordaunt at the very last minute.
Yeah, I mean, it did all change pretty rapidly, didn't it? As you say, from three possible contenders down to just one. And I think it's a sign that within the Conservative Parliamentary Party, there was a desire to put an end to all of this, really. I mean, let's not forget Liz Truss, Prime Minister for just 7 weeks. And I think the turmoil that has caused within the party, lots of MPs extremely concerned about what that is doing to their popularity, as well as knowing that this government has to get on and make some very difficult decisions. So in the end, Penny Mordaunt's team suggesting she got around 90 people to support her. We might find that out later, but not enough. And even if she had, there was a lot of pressure going to be put on her to stand down, to end this contest as quickly as possible, and really just to try to move on. So for Rishi Sunak, a huge turnaround, having been so disappointed in the summer, losing out to Liz Truss when it went to the Conservative Party membership. He will now come into Downing Street as Prime Minister and will immediately have to get on with tackling some of those incredibly difficult issues.
Vicky, thank you very much indeed. That's Vicky Young there, our Deputy Political Editor. We'll leave you with these aerial pictures then, live of Westminster on another dramatic day there. Just a few minutes ago, we heard from Sir Graham Brady, who is chair of the 1922 Committee of Conservative Party Backbenchers, that he had only received one nomination for the leadership of the Conservative Party after Penny Mordaunt, as you were just hearing, pulled out of the contest at the very last moment because she didn't have enough nominations. She needed 100 as a minimum. She wasn't anywhere near that. And Sir Graham Brady then declared Rishi Sunak as the only nomination and therefore the next leader of the Conservative Party. There were loud cheers and bangs on the table from Tory MPs, and he becomes the United Kingdom's next Prime Minister. That's it from the BBC News at 1. Thank you very much for watching.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to BBC News live from Downing Street. 7 weeks after losing to Liz Truss in this year's first Tory leadership contest, Rishi Sunak has emerged as victor in this one. He is set to become the UK's next Prime Minister tomorrow, the first from a British Asian background. He'll take office as the country faces enormous economic challenges. The ex-Chancellor, who is addressing Conservative MPs in private around now, gained the support of more than half of Conservative MPs, with his rival Penny Mordaunt struggling to reach the threshold needed to go forward in the contest of 100 nominations. Here's the moment the announcement was made by by Sir Graham Brady, who chairs the committee running the leadership contest.
Good afternoon. As returning officer in the leadership election, I can confirm that we have received one valid nomination. And Rishi Sunak is therefore elected as leader of the Conservative Party.
Moment the result was announced. Let's take a look then at our next Prime Minister. The former Chancellor Rishi Sunak had been the favourite to succeed his old boss Boris Johnson as Prime Minister after his resignation in July, but he failed to persuade Tory party members who ultimately put Liz Truss in Downing Street in September. Rishi Sunak, who has not commented on the recent turmoil, said he was standing as Prime Minister to fix a profound economic crisis, as well as to unite his party. He became Chancellor in February 2020 and within weeks found himself having to steer the UK economy as the pandemic and its lockdowns began. In April, the finances of Rishi Sunak and his family came under intense scrutiny, with the tax affairs of his heiress wife, Akshata Murthy, placed in the spotlight. She later announced she would start paying UK tax on her overseas earnings to relieve political pressure on her husband. Rishi Sunak is a practicing Hindu and he will become the first Asian Prime Minister. And it is Diwali. And 2 years ago, as Chancellor, when it was Diwali, he lit candles outside Number 11, and he's since said that was one of his proudest achievements in politics. Well, with me now is our Chief Political Correspondent, Nick Eardley. Well, this is another big moment, Nick, another Prime Minister.
It's a huge moment, Joanna, partly because Rishi Sunak is someone who will come into this office with some of the biggest challenges that any Prime Minister in modern history has faced. I said that 7 weeks ago in Downing Street when Liz Truss took over, but the challenges that Rishi Sunak is going to face have only gone up over the past few weeks. He is going to have to try and steady the ship economically. We have a rough idea about how he wants to do that, because he's talked about sound fiscal management, about not borrowing too much, about balancing the books. He did that during the summer anyway. But as you were just saying, we've not heard from Rishi Sunak in public for weeks. He has not spoken at all to any broadcaster in any interview, to anyone really, apart from behind closed doors, about what he wants to do with power. It's a week today, as things stand, until the next big fiscal statement from the new Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, is supposed to happen in the House of Commons. I suspect they will want to keep that date because they want to make their intervention in the economy before the Bank of England makes its next big decision on interest rates. But Rishi Sunak will enter number 10 facing a huge, daunting entry. The economy at home, the war in Ukraine, global questions about inflation, about supply economics, about how exactly you steady the ship without spooking markets even further. And then, all that time, he will be facing questions from opposition parties and even some of his own MPs, it seems, about whether he needs to call a general election to get a mandate to do what he wants to do. All the expectation in the Conservative Party and in Parliament in general is that the next government under Mr Sunak is going to have to make extremely difficult economic decisions. That means cuts, and it may mean taxes going up in some senses. And there will be questions, I think, about whether Mr Sunak has the mandate to do that, given that Boris Johnson was the one who won the election back in 2019. Liz Truss was the one who won the vote of Conservative members just 7 weeks ago. Mr Sunak has now been put in place by his MPs.
Just before I go on to talk about the economics with Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, just another word about the politics, because you said Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, will be delivering that fiscal statement on the 31st. What's expected in terms of whether the people currently in those key posts actually will stay?
I don't know. is the simple answer. I've asked Team Sunak, and the whole time that we've been asking these questions, they've said they're not getting ahead of themselves, so they're not making those decisions. My hunch is that given that Mr Hunt has managed to steady the ship a bit, that he is likely to stay as Chancellor for stability, if for no other reason. But we will find out, I suspect, more about that tomorrow. My expectation is we won't see Liz Truss leave number 10 today and Mr Sunak enter. I'd expect that to happen tomorrow by the time all the logistics get sorted out. And if Mr Sunak is in there by tomorrow afternoon, he will then have to start that job of putting together his cabinet, of getting around the table with his top team, including his Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, or whoever that may be, and figuring out what tough choices they are going to make to try and balance the books, to try and steady the economy. A lot of people have asked privately over the last few weeks who would want to be Prime Minister, given all the challenges that the country's facing at the moment. Rishi Sunak will take up that job tomorrow.
Thank you, Nick. Well, let's pick up with the economic conversation with Paul Johnson, Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And Paul Johnson, how difficult are those choices that he's going to have to make going to be?
Well, there are certainly some very difficult choices coming down the road. The public finances are not in a great position, despite the undoing of most of the tax cuts that were announced a month or so ago. And one of the problems, I think, that the new Prime Minister and his Chancellor face is that given all of the uncertainty that's been created over the last few weeks, they may have to make more difficult decisions than they otherwise would have had to, because the markets are still somewhat spooked, and they're going to be wanting to see some clear and decisive action, perhaps more than they would have required had we not had all of this upset over the last few weeks.
And that brings us back to a question that's been asked a number of times since the so-called mini-budget. Who's in charge in the end? Is it the markets?
Well, the markets, in some sense, are always in charge. I mean, we are all part of the markets. The decisions that we as citizens make matter enormously for what's happening to the economy, but also the decisions that people who we are borrowing from as a nation make. I mean, don't forget, this is all about us borrowing hundreds and hundreds of billions of pounds, and someone has to be willing to lend us that money. And if they stop being willing to lend us that money because they're unconvinced about the stability of the government or the extent to which their fiscal policies make sense, then they don't have to lend us that money. We are beholden to them. But all that means is that we need a sustainable, sensible, rational fiscal policy. Now, what we saw on September the 23rd was a government deviating from that to some quite considerable degree. That still leaves an enormous amount of scope for very different policies. You can see that Germany and France, the USA and Australia have completely different sets of policies. They're all well-functioning economies in one sense or another. You just have to make choices within constraints and recognise those constraints. So yes, we are constrained by what we do. We can't just do whatever we want because things cost money, and we can't just magic up economic activity from nowhere. And I think that was the mistake that the previous Chancellor made.
When you say there is an enormous amount of scope for different policies, how much scope is there? I mean, where are you thinking there is scope? Because the rowing back of the tax cuts that was announced previously, I think your estimates were that it would save, well, no, the Chancellor said it would save £23 billion of public spending, but then I think that your estimates were that there'd be still a £40 billion black hole. Does that get filled by spending cuts? I mean, it's a lot of spending cuts, or it's a lot of tax rises. So how much scope is there for flexibility?
Well, there's long-term and short-term questions that we need to answer as a country. In the long term, we need to decide whether we want to be a country more like most of those in Western Europe, where there are much higher levels of tax and much higher levels of public spending than we have here, or whether we want to be a country like some of the others, often the Anglophone countries in the OECD, the US, Australia, Canada, which have lower levels of tax and lower levels of spending. What we can't have, obviously, is low tax and high spending. So that's what I meant by the scope of the choices that are available. In the shorter term, it looks like we're going to have either some relatively modest increases in taxation or some quite difficult cuts in spending in order to get us towards a fiscally sustainable position. But we are in the midst of huge economic uncertainty. So I think the ideal position to be in would be to say, actually, we're not going to make big decisions in the short run. We're going to wait and see where we are in a year or two. And that's where I do wonder whether the current uncertainty makes that perfectly sensible decision more difficult to achieve, because everything is so spooked that saying, well, we'll make those hard decisions in a year or two might look even less credible than it would have done just a few months ago.
What is your sense of what it's going to look like? It's been said that it's going to be austerity that's going to be a lot harder than it was under the coalition government because of what's happening with inflation.
Well, even if the government, the Chancellor, doesn't make any further decisions, the next couple of years are going to be quite difficult from a public spending perspective, because, of course, the public spending plans were put in place a year ago when we expected inflation to be only 2 or 3%, and it's turning out at 10%. We've already seen that in terms of public sector pay going up much, much less quickly than prices and rather less quickly than pay in the private sector, and that's likely to continue over the next couple of years. So continuing to pay our teachers and nurses and so on much less in real terms than they have historically been used to is going to be very difficult to achieve. If you want to do more than that, if you want to cut spending further, particularly, of course, since we've come off a decade of incredibly tight spending settlements, that's just going to be very hard. And you look at where the big spending is, biggest by far is the health service. Well, I don't see any government cutting the health service. Then the next is pensions. We've already seen the government's not wanting to reduce pensions, then working age welfare, which goes to the poorest people in the country, then education. Where do you get significant cuts out of all of those genuinely, both politically and economically hard?
Thank you very much. That's Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And just to say that we're looking at the Palace of Westminster, and that is where Rishi Sunak is currently speaking to MPs as the incoming Prime Minister. It's behind closed doors, so we don't have cameras on it, but word will start to come out about what is being said, and we're keeping a watchful eye on that, and we'll bring you comments from inside that closed session as soon as we hear any word. OK, well, let's go to Fiona Trott, who's in Wakefield, gauging reaction there. Fiona.
There's been quite a positive reaction here so far from people, because they say, as Chancellor, he got us through the pandemic, he helped businesses through furlough, perhaps he can help us through the cost of living crisis too. Let me introduce you, though, to Julie and Michelle. Julie, first of all, tell me what you think of Rishi Sunak becoming the new Prime Minister.
No, thank you. He wasn't elected by the people, and I think that is the big no-no. I think that after 3 Prime Ministers in a short period of time, we should have a general election. We should be allowed to elect who we want in Parliament, not just the members.
Michelle, what do you think?
I agree with Julie. I mean, yes, they might have his ideas and what he wants to do, but at the moment I just feel that the government, the Conservative government and the politicians are 100% behind him, because there's a lot of them as well who are wanting other people in, and I think it's going to be a hard task to get them all together to put into place his policies where he wants to put in, and to hopefully bring us back to some sort of normality, not poverty, what we are at the moment.
What's normality for you? What do you want him to deliver for you?
I'd like to see a better NHS. I'd like to see for families with young people with disabilities and people with disabilities, whatever age, being able to live and not thinking about what the food that they need to get in, the gas, the electricity. I think there's a lot of things at the moment where people are more worried about how they're going to live the next year.
Julie, what do you want from the new Prime Minister?
I'd like to see a better NHS. I've been waiting 4 years now for a new knee. 9 years trying to find a dentist. It's not good. The NHS is literally on its knees, and it's wrong. Mental health is suffering. It's just so wrong.
Do you think Rishi Sunak and the new cabinet can achieve that, solve the NHS? The social, we know that the national insurance tax is not going to go up to help pay for that. So what do you think going forward?
I don't think they will. I really don't think they will. I think they make all these promises and nothing happens. It's been this way for too many years now. You know, we're promised the earth and it just doesn't happen. So no, I don't think it can solve it.
What do you think?
I just feel the money what we had as a country has dwindled. I mean, yes, COVID didn't help, and yes, they did back up by putting furlough and that in, and it helped keep jobs, but I just think the money situation for families and the government, there's nothing there to improve what we're at the moment.
What do you say though when politicians turn around and say, look, this is the situation that we're in, you know, we've had the problems with the Ukraine and, you know, the cost of living crisis, these are all things that we couldn't foresee. Yes. It's going to be a long journey, but we're going to get there in the end.
Yes, that's a whole question, that's a hard question to ask, but I just feel that, like as I said earlier, I don't think he's got the support behind him to put in place what really needs to be put in place.
But do you have faith in him?
No, I don't. No, if I'm honest, I don't. I'd rather it go to a general election and let people choose.
Okay, well, thank you both very much for chatting to us here in Wakefield today. So there we are. I think the real challenge for the new Prime Minister at the moment is that in places like Wakefield in the past relied so much on manufacturing and coal mining, and now it needs to be levelled up. It's something that Wakefield has asked for, and that's a challenge for the new Prime Minister. It promised in 2019 to deliver on that, but now faced with these new challenges, I think people here, although they say that some of them think that he's the right person for the job, they're less positive, less optimistic if they think that he will actually achieve that in the future.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Let me just bring you some of the flavour of what's going on behind closed doors where Rishi Sunak is addressing Tory MPs. Ione Wells, our political correspondent, says he went into a room of backbench Tory MPs accompanied by some of his loyal backers and received a rapturous round of applause and banging of fists on desks by Tory MPs in the room. She says, remember, a lot of them wanted him to be Prime Minister earlier this summer too, after he came top of the MP's rounds of voting in the first leadership race, and that was before he lost out to Liz Truss in the party members' vote. So he is currently speaking to them. How much he will be revealing of his programme of government, we've yet to find out, because he hasn't said anything on camera in terms of what his plans will be. What we had when it was confirmed that he was standing to be Tory leader and Prime Minister was just a tweet outlining his desire to do that. So there's going to be a lot, obviously, of questions being asked of him inside that meeting in terms of the pledges that he will be making. So he is going to have a very full in-tray. He's got to prepare for that new fiscal statement next week. The economic situation is significantly worse than it was when Liz Truss took office. Higher mortgage rates, energy bills and inflation are all combining to make it a really tough winter for many people. The NHS and the social care system are struggling, and the war in Ukraine, which is driving those high energy bills, continues to grind on. Well, speaking before it was announced that Rishi Sunak would be the next Prime Minister, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said any change at the top is bad news for Scottish people.
You know, whoever it is in number 10, and let's assume it's going to be Rishi Sunak, a Chancellor, remember, who has already been one of the authors of the economic and cost of living crisis that the UK is living through right now. But whoever it is, the real worry is the next phase of austerity that a week today is going to be unleashed. That's what Scotland needs an alternative to, because it's not inevitable. It's being made the case by Brexit, by Tory economic mismanagement. It does not have to be this way. And Tories want us to believe, and Labour to a certain extent as well, want us to believe that life outside the European Union with these austerity cuts is as good as it gets. It shouldn't be as good as it gets, and for Scotland it's not as good as it gets. We need an alternative to that. Well, look, Rishi Sunak will be yet another Tory Prime Minister that Scotland hasn't voted for. And if Scotland was given the opportunity today, I would bet my bottom dollar that Scotland would not vote for Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister. So this is the position Scotland is in, having to cross our fingers and hope for the least worst option in terms of UK governments. And again, I would say we can do better than this. We can choose our own governments, and we can actually apply our own values to leading Scotland on the track that we want, rather than being taken down the wrong track by successive UK governments. Back in the European Union and in charge of our own destiny. That's what independence offers Scotland, and it's got to be better than this chaos and economic carnage that has been inflicted on us by one Tory Prime Minister after another.
Nicola Sturgeon. Well, let's talk now to the political historian at University College London, Dr. Sam Blacksford. Welcome. So we have our fifth Conservative Prime Minister in 6 years. Give us your perspective as an historian.
Well, it's unprecedented. We say that all the time, but this genuinely is. The Conservative Party used to make a virtue of having leaders who were in position for a very long time. People were very loyal to them. And now we've had this succession of quite short-term prime ministers who've been, by historic standards, quite lightweight. And it just doesn't reflect very well on the party. And of course, it doesn't really bode well for the country either. There's been a very significant issue here, which is that, especially with Liz Truss, but to an extent Boris Johnson as well, was that the decision to choose who the Prime Minister would be was actually farmed out to Conservative Party members. Now, that's not historically a very consistent thing that's been done. That's a very recent thing from the 2000s. What we've seen today with Rishi Sunak being essentially selected unopposed, or not, having not to go to a contest amongst the members, is much more consistent with the longer term ways of doing things. And actually that's a much more coherent way and a more constitutional way of selecting a prime minister, because ultimately a prime minister needs to command the support of their fellow MPs, and that's one of the reasons why Liz Truss failed.
And so do you think that is going to be conducive to greater unity going forward for him?
It can't be a bad thing for him, I would imagine, because at the end of the day, you need to get your business through the House of Commons by having your MPs, your backbench MPs supporting you. And it's very clear from the numbers that Rishi Sunak has amassed in the past couple of days that he is the one who can achieve that. You know, there was always obviously some temptation to bring Boris Johnson back, because despite all his flaws and all his failures and this looming privileges committee, etc., he was a very good campaigner. But ultimately, he was tarnished, and you've now got someone who might be able to reach out to people across the country, but also will be able to, like I say, command the support of his MPs, which is the really crucial thing that they need. But let's be frank about this. At the end of the day, Sunak faces a set of challenges that are almost again unprecedented. It's going to be an incredibly difficult winter, and the public support for the Conservative Party is at absolute rock bottom. It was at rock bottom anyway after 12 years of government. Governments tend to get tired and people lose or get out of favour of them. But with what's happened in the past 6-8 weeks, which has looked terribly self-indulgent on the part of the Conservative Party, having this long leadership contest and then this very short stint as Liz Truss Prime Minister, Sunak is going to have a lot of luck to pull the party's fortunes back from here.
And there are a lot of calls for there to be a general election. There's no constitutional imperative for that, but would you expect those calls to remain?
I expect there to be the calls to remain. I don't expect them to be heeded, because the Conservative Party are absolutely not going to call a general election now, because they'd lose probably hundreds of seats based on the current polling. Like you say, it's not constitutional. There's no real need to have a general election. We don't vote in prime ministers. We vote in parties, and the Conservative Party has a majority in Parliament at the moment. That's what matters. But I do sympathise with people, political opponents, members of the public, people who you were just speaking to then a minute ago before Nicola Sturgeon, who say that they want a general election, because ultimately, if you just see prime minister after prime minister after prime minister who then go and try and do different things, you can understand why the public might want their say. But constitutionally, there's no need to have one.
Dr. Sam Blacksford, political historian from University College London, thank you very much for joining us. Well, with me as our chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley. How do you expect things to unfold from here, Nick?
Well, look, I think Rishi Sunak will become Prime Minister formally probably tomorrow now. The logistics of getting it done today are probably too much. So that moment where Liz Truss emerges, leaves, goes to the palace, and Rishi Sunak then arrives, and the King will have that transition for the first time. Then when Rishi Sunak comes back here and addresses the nation, that will probably happen tomorrow. I suspect a lot of people will want to hear from the new Prime Minister before then, given that he has said nothing publicly as part of this campaign, apart from a couple of tweets. I have spoken to one MP who was in the room at the 1922 committee, who says they were impressed by Mr Sunak. He said that the party needed to unite and to get on with delivering a cabinet that had all the talents in it, and maybe a hint that he's going to look at a broad range of the party to try and get some sort of unity. But it's likely to be tomorrow that we get those big moments where Rishi Sunak sets out his vision to the country, tells us who's going to be in his cabinet, whether Jeremy Hunt remains as Chancellor, for example, who else he wants in his top team. It's going to be a really significant moment, because the challenges that Mr Sunak is going to face in that famous black door are quite something. You know, the economic challenges, the political challenges that he faces as a Conservative Prime Minister, given the turmoil of the last few years in his party, are going to be significant as well.
What does he stand for? What's his brand of conservatism?
Well, look, I think we got a good idea over the summer that he wants to govern in a way that balances the books, that doesn't borrow a lot of money for everyday spending on government initiatives or on cutting taxes or anything like that, like Liz Truss did. He will be different to that. I suspect he will want to balance the books as quickly as he can and make it clear he wants to do that. But it's a really interesting question, Joanna, because we heard from Rishi Sunak over the summer where he almost became defined as not Liz Truss. His warnings were all about Liz Truss and what she planned. His allies would say he was proved right. The big question is, given all the chaos we've seen over the last few weeks and the worsening economic pictures, what actual concrete decisions he's going to take now.
Thank you very much, Nick, and that is the key question. He's currently speaking to Conservative MPs. How much detail he'll be giving them, it's probably not likely to be going into much detail. What we do know is he received a warm welcome from those MPs as he begins his new position as Prime Minister. Now, time for a look at the weather with Stav.
Hello there. This upcoming week is remaining fairly unsettled with low pressure nearby, and with low pressure to the west of us out in the Atlantic, it means we're going to continue to see south or southwesterly winds. So temperatures will remain above the seasonal norm throughout the week in all areas, and there will be further rain at times, but also some sunshine too. But it's going to be very mild both by day and by night. Now, through this evening and overnight, any showers will affect more northern and western areas. It'll tend to stay drier further south and east that you are.
parliamentary colleagues should be supporting the Prime Minister, supporting the government, supporting the British people.
Rishi Sunak addresses Conservative MPs in private after the announcement. Stay with us for updates throughout the day. Good afternoon and welcome to BBC News if you're watching in the UK or around the world. 7 weeks after losing to Liz Truss in this year's first Tory leadership contest, Rishi Sunak has now emerged victor in this second one. He is set to become the UK's next Prime Minister tomorrow, the first from a British Asian background. He'll take office as the country faces enormous economic challenges. The ex-Chancellor, who is currently addressing Conservative MPs in private, gained the support of well over half of Conservative MPs, with his rival Penny Mordaunt struggling to reach the threshold needed to go forward in the contest of 100 nominations. Rishi Sunak is likely to formally become the Prime Minister tomorrow. King Charles will be heading back to London this afternoon from Sandringham, his estate in Norfolk, and he will invite the ex-Chancellor then to form a government. Here's the moment the announcement of the winner of the leadership election was made by Sir Graham Brady, who chairs the committee running the contest, in front of a noisy group of MPs.
Good afternoon. As returning officer in the leadership election, I can confirm that we have received one valid nomination. And Rishi Sunak is therefore elected as leader of the Conservative Party.
Graham Brady. Sunak, who has not commented on the recent turmoil, said he was standing as Prime Minister to fix a profound economic crisis, as well as to unite his party. He became Chancellor in February 2020, and within weeks he found himself having to steer the UK economy as the pandemic and its lockdowns began. In April, the finances of Rishi Sunak and his family came under intense scrutiny, with the tax affairs of his heiress wife, Akshata Murthy, placed in the spotlight. She later announced she would start paying UK tax on her overseas earnings to relieve political pressure on her husband. Rishi Sunak is a practicing Hindu and will become the first Asian Prime Minister. And it is Diwali today, and when he was Chancellor 2 years ago and it was Diwali, he lit the candles outside number 11 Downing Street. He said it was one of his proudest moments of his political career. So potentially tonight he could be lighting those candles outside number 10. With me, our chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley. Might he be in number 10 before the end of the day?
I think it's unlikely. I think the logistics of getting Liz Truss out and getting the King ready to receive both Liz Truss and Mr Sunak, and getting Mr Sunak in, probably mean that it's tomorrow that Rishi Sunak formally becomes Prime Minister. 7 weeks to the day since Liz Truss took over here. And it will be a really significant and difficult moment, because we're in the extraordinary position where we know there will be a new Prime Minister, probably this time tomorrow. We know who they are. We haven't heard them say anything about what they want to do beyond a statement confirming that they were standing. Now, Mr Sunak has just been appearing before Conservative MPs. I think he'll probably want to speak to the nation at some point, but there will be that moment tomorrow afternoon where Mr Sunak will stand in front of the nation and will have to set out how he intends to steer the ship economically and how he intends to get things running smoothly again.
We've got a tweet from Liz Truss saying, Congratulations, Rishi Sunak, on being appointed as leader of the Conservative Party and our next Prime Minister. You have my full support. Well, she goes down in history as being the shortest serving Prime Minister, and he is the youngest for a very, very long time.
What a turnaround, because it was only 7 weeks ago today that Ms Truss fairly comfortably beat Mr Sunak in the leadership campaign, you know, with that vote of Conservative members who seem to like her pledge for lower taxes, to govern in a more Conservative way. They are not going to get that with Mr Sunak. He is going to have to tighten belts, and that means that I think in the immediate term, tax cuts are off the agenda. Remember that towards the end of the last campaign, Mr Sunak was promising some pretty big tax cuts over the next few years to bring down income tax by 4p by the end of the next Parliament. No word from his campaign yet about whether that prospect is ditched, but we know that the new Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has made it clear that the plan to even take income tax down by a penny has been postponed indefinitely. Likewise for Mr Sunak, that big question about what he wants to do on energy support. He was promising targeted interventions during the leadership campaign of the summer. Well, Liz Truss is spending a lot of money on getting people through the next 6 months. Her plan to do it for 2 years was curtailed by the new Chancellor, but Mr Sunak has to set out his plans on that. So, you know, I'd like to tell you a lot more about what Mr Sunak wants to do when he's in there tomorrow, but we don't know for sure, and it will be his responsibility to start setting that out to the country very, very soon.
Thank you, Nick. And we are only a week away from the fiscal statement, which is going to be outlined by the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. We expect it to still be him in the position of Chancellor, and that will be giving detail on what the economic plans will look like going forward. Well, let's go to our correspondent Helen Catt, who's in Central Lobby. What is the mood among Tory MPs, Helen?
Central Lobby has been busier in the last couple of hours than I've seen it in quite a while as MPs come along, and all the talk is of unity. But in terms of what Rishi Sunak might do as Prime Minister, what he's promising, well, I have someone with me who might be able to shed a little bit of light on that for us. This is Miriam Cage. She's the MP for Penistone and Stocksbridge in South Yorkshire. Rishi Sunak's been talking to Conservative MPs in the last hour. What's he said to you?
Well, he's told us about his manifesto, really, which is to stand on the 2019 manifesto. That's what we were all elected on. That hasn't changed. A manifesto commitment to unite, to level up and to deliver on the promises of Brexit, which we've still yet to complete. So it's very much about that, about continuing the manifesto. But I think also he called on us to be united, of course, and that's being well reported. But I think very astutely he pointed out that most of our divisions as a party over the last 6 months that have been so widely reported have not really been about policy. I mean, of course, there are policy differences in a broad church, in the Conservative Party, but actually it's been much more about personality and character and the kind of events that have been so widely reported. And a lot of that political discord and turmoil, you know, has been our own fault, let's be honest. But it's been the divisions about personality rather than policy that have brought us to this situation. So I think he pointed out that actually we can unite around the policy. This is the time to
why will that change if it's about personality? Because it's the same people in Parliament. That hasn't changed.
Well, I think who the leader is has a huge impact on how willing MPs are to follow that leader. You know, there is no leader without followers. And I think what we saw at the end of Boris Johnson's time in office, and, you know, I supported Boris Johnson to the last, was increasing number and increasing proportion of MPs who just weren't willing to follow him as leader. We've seen that with Liz. But I think Rishi, over just 3 days, has managed to garner the support of nearly 2/3 of the party who are willing to.
Although some of those are just doing it for unity. You know, there's probably the core of real Sunak believers, if you like, would arguably be a lot smaller.
Well, I think if you think back to 2019 in the leadership race that Boris Johnson won, in the final round of MP voting, he only got 51% of the vote. So, of course, he was a well-loved, liked leader with a lot of respect, but it wasn't the case that he commanded the vast majority of the parliamentary party. And I think the key thing is no leader is ever going to have the full support of the whole party. We're too broad a church. But what they need to have is the respect of those people who wouldn't necessarily call that person their first choice, and Rishi absolutely has the respect of our party.
And can he win in constituencies like yours?
Well, that isn't actually a question for now, because the question for now is, can we stabilise this economic situation, and can we use that stability to deliver on our manifesto commitments? And at the end of the day, when the next general election comes, we will be judged on that. Have we delivered on levelling up? Have we delivered on our other promises?
Miriam Cates, thank you very much. So one initial response there for you, as you heard, Rishi Sunak, as the new Conservative leader, has been talking to his MPs here in Parliament. We'll have to wait a bit longer to hear from him to speak to the country.
Thank you, Helen. And I'm just seeing that he has told MPs there will not be a general election. That's the intention. There will not be a general election. There needs to be party unity and discipline in order to avoid a general election. So let's see whether that is delivered. But by the fact that he has been anointed by the support of his MPs, it is indicating some MPs are saying that there is, and some experts are saying that there is more likely to be unity going forward. Well, Rishi Sunak is of course going to be the UK's next Prime Minister after Penny Mordaunt dropped out of the Tory leadership race in the final minutes before nominations closed. Let's get more reaction to it by Professor Sir John Curtis, Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University. Welcome. Well, we'll come to him saying there won't be a general election in a moment, but first of all, your reaction to the fact that it's Rishi Sunak and that he's done it without having to go to a wider vote.
Well, I think, to be honest, that was the direction in which this contest was heading for quite a while. It was pretty clear within hours of Boris Johnson indicating that he might attempt to enter the contest, is that while there was undoubtedly a body of MPs who are loyal to him, and that he would indeed certainly do pretty well amongst the membership, there was by no means guaranteed to win, that he might well struggle to form an administration because there would be so many MPs who wouldn't be willing to take part in a Boris Johnson-led government that he would be in trouble. And of course, we also then got reminded about his involvement in Partygate. So I think the truth is that a realistic assessment of Boris Johnson's chances, the moment it became clear he might try, was that his chances didn't look very good indeed. Penny Mordaunt's problem, meanwhile, is rather different. Her problem, I think, at the end of the day, she's just not well enough known to be somebody to be able to convince MPs that she should be taking on somebody like Rishi Sunak at this point, given that the problem the Conservatives face above all now is the way in which their economic credibility has been squandered by the economic events of the last 4 weeks, and that above all, what the Conservatives have to do in the next 2 years is try to turn both the finances of the government around, and in the wake of that, to try to turn the economy around, both of which are at the moment sitting in accident and emergency in bad need of some political and economic medicine.
So Rishi Sunak has said there will not be an early general election. Will that be within his gift? Will there be the unity that is required for that to be the case?
Well, you're right. The only reason why Mr. Sunak's wish not to have a general election would not be able to hold water is if he isn't able to maintain the confidence of the House of Commons. And that gets us back to, the crucial question is, can he get his party more united? Now, I think he will have fewer problems than Boris Johnson would have had, but he'll certainly have problems, and he will certainly find that on a day-to-day basis that a combination of personal animosities and ideological division will mean that he may well have to duck and weave and tack on various occasions in order to avoid defeat inside the House of Commons. So, his first difficult task will be to work out how to deal with the tax increases and spending cuts that are required. There are clearly some Conservative MPs who would prefer to see spending cuts rather than tax increases, but others who feel that if spending cuts means doing particular damage to the poor, including those on welfare benefits, they won't be happy. So he's going to have to negotiate a potentially difficult path there. Levelling up, well, we discovered during his own leadership campaign in the summer that levelling up means different things to different people and can cause a certain amount of animosity and difficulty amongst Conservative MPs and Conservative members inside the south of England. Brexit. Well, the party's not divided over the principle of Brexit, but there are still arguments about how it should be implemented. And that's going to come to the fore very quickly. The government's going to have to decide by Friday as to whether or not to allow an election in Northern Ireland to go ahead, given that the DUP are not still willing to form an administration because of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So there are plenty of potential headaches here. But the fact that he has managed, in effect, to achieve a coronation will give him an early boost of authority inside his party. He will also be helped if, and it's probably reasonably likely, that there is at least some recovery in the Conservative position in the polls, and that therefore he can demonstrate to his MPs that there is at least some short-term political dividend in the fact that he has become leader.
Professor Sir John Curtis, thank you very much. Well, let's get some reaction from the SNP MP for Aberdeen South, Stephen Flynn. Welcome. So he has been anointed as the new Conservative Party leader, the new Prime Minister. Does that mean it's looking less likely that you'll get the general election that you want to see?
I think what we've just heard there in relation to the general election is that Rishi Sunak is running scared. He's running scared of a general election, just as he's running scared of an independence referendum, which of course is our focus at this moment in time. But to take a little bit of a Scottish perspective on this is just another Tory Prime Minister, just another Tory Prime Minister. That the people of Scotland didn't vote for. He's the 10th since 1955, and it highlights the real democratic deficit that sits at the heart of this union. Obviously, people right across the UK are reeling at this moment in time from the fact that we have a Prime Minister who is now going to be in place that the public haven't voted on. But that's not an uncommon thing for people in Scotland when it comes to Tory Prime Ministers.
You talk obviously about the Scottish perspective and the desire for an independence referendum, which the SNP are being very clear about. But if Rishi Sunak can run a tight ship, if there is going to be unity, stability, we may be 2 years away from a general election. And of course, the position from Westminster very much is that this is not the time for an independence referendum.
The unity and the stability that the people of Scotland need is to have governments that we vote for and governments that implement policies that are, in our view, the right ones to do. That's why we have Scottish parliamentary elections and the SNP are successful, and of course the Tories are not yet. Despite that, we still have Tory governments imposed upon us time after time, and this is just another example of that. But Rishi Sunak, when you look at his policies, is actually quite scary. This is a man who during the summer said quite clearly that he was happy to take money from poorer areas to put it into wealthier communities. This is a guy who during the pandemic, of course, provided no financial support whatsoever to some 3 million people they excluded as they came to be known. And of course, much like Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak was fined during, as a result of his actions during Partygate. He is not quite clearly fit for office, and he has no mandate, not just from the people of the UK, but from the people of Scotland.
Stephen Flynn for the SNP, thank you. Well, Rishi Sunak, who will be the next Prime Minister, will have an in-tray full of huge challenges. The economic situation is significantly worse than it was when Liz Truss took office. Higher mortgage rates, energy bills and inflation are all combining to make it a really tough winter for many people. The NHS and social care system is struggling, and the war in Ukraine to Andy Verity for more on those challenges. Andy.
Well, Joanna, you're right. There are huge economic challenges. We've got at the moment what you call stagflation, a combination of the economy stagnating and the worst inflation in 40 years. The pound has devalued. It's lost more than a fifth of its value since the start of this calendar year. But some of the signs on the markets today have been signalling that there's relief, at least, that Boris Johnson isn't going back to Downing Street, and perhaps also that Rishi Sunak is going to be the one to replace him as Conservative Party leader. So, for example, that key interest rate that we've been watching, the yield on 5-year gilts, I'll translate that for you, is the cost of borrowing at a fixed interest rate over 5 years. Whatever it costs the government, it's got to cost the mortgage lenders a little bit more. So at the moment, there's been a big move in that. When we heard that Boris Johnson wasn't going to run, the markets reacted by cutting that. In other words, saying the risks have lessened, we don't need quite as much interest to compensate for our risk of lending to the UK government. And it dropped by 30 basis points, 30 1/100ths of a percentage point. So that was a relief, if you like, that the anxiety they had on Friday, which pushed those interest rates up, was not there anymore. And then they extended that after the news about Rishi Sunak by a few more points. So that's saying we're not worried about Rishi Sunak at the very least, and we're certainly glad that he's not Boris Johnson.
We're a week away from the fiscal statement. Of course, we saw what happened with the market reaction to the mini budget. The markets, as you're saying, have already effectively priced in what they think a Rishi Sunak premiership will mean.
Well, that's right. I mean, they've priced in what Jeremy Hunt has done, and a big question they'll be asking now is, will we still have the same thing from the Chancellor? Will we still have Jeremy Hunt's plans on the table? And I think they'll be loath to depart too much from that because of the risk of a bond market sell-off if they get it wrong. But we should remember that even after Jeremy Hunt trimmed back Kwasi Kwarteng's big tax cuts, they're still spending substantially more than they planned to, say, a few months ago, because they're spending more on the energy bill help for households and businesses. That's a good 60 billion or so added to it. So they're not funding everything. They're not coming up with a corresponding tax rise or spending cut for everything that the government is giving away. And there's a key question here, which is of timing. It's not just a binary thing. Either you do austerity or you get murdered on the markets. It's a question of timing. You might do expansionary policies now, putting more money into households' finances now and businesses to compensate for the energy price shock, and then do spending cuts or tax rises later, further down the line, in order to present a credible plan of this is how we get the finances back on track. But what I think very few economists would advocate is that going into a recession, they'd want to do deep spending cuts, more austerity. We've learned the lesson from 12 years ago when, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, government said we've got to fix the public finances now. And what that led to was weak growth and the worst decade for improvements in living standards in 200 years. They won't want to repeat those mistakes.
Thank you very much, Andy. Well, Labour have reiterated their call for a general election, as have the Scottish National Party and the Liberal Democrats. We can talk to the Liberal Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Daisy Cooper. Welcome. What is your reaction to the anointment of Rishi Sunak?
Well, he's the third out-of-touch Conservative Prime Minister in just as many months. And the situation, quite frankly, is that people are sick and tired of this Conservative chaos. And that's why the Liberal Democrats are calling for a general election to be called right now.
And I'm so sorry, I couldn't hear you just then because something was happening in my ear. So I completely missed what you said. But you obviously are calling for a general election. Rishi Sunak has said that there will not be a general election. If he can deliver stability and unity within his party, there won't be a general election. Nothing can force one for another 2 years.
Well, I think what's important for Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party to realise is that it is the Conservative Party itself that has caused so much chaos and so much instability. And the only way to get rid of that chaos and instability is to remove the Conservative Party from government. There is overwhelming support across the country for a general election. I think it's outrageous that we are now on the third Conservative Prime Minister in just as many months, and the public are not being given a say in who they want to take the country forward and to solve these unprecedented crises. The fact is there has to be a general election because that's the only way that we can move forward from the chaos and instability that the Conservative Party itself has created.
But what we see is that the markets are stabilising, that Rishi Sunak is... they've responded well to the thought that it was going to be Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister. Why not, if you're so concerned about stability, let that settle, see what happens? And would that not be preferable to a general election right now, which would actually just bring more uncertainty?
Well, the markets, as you say, do appear to have improved slightly, but the situation facing struggling families across the country has not. The fact is that Rishi Sunak refused to implement a proper windfall tax. He was supporting Boris Johnson even when he was proven to be a liar, and a lawbreaker. This is a man who boasted during the leadership contest in the summer about taking money away from poor communities and giving it to richer communities. We have a twin-demic facing the NHS and our care services, and our health and care services have been run into the ground by these successive Conservative prime ministers. There are so many problems facing our country right now, and it's clear from months of infighting and years of infighting that the Conservative Party does not have a plan and cannot be trusted. They are out of touch and they should be out of government.
Thank you very much for joining us. Well, let me just take you live to those pictures that we can see on the screen right now, and that's outside Conservative HQ. We can see Matt Hancock there talking with others as they wait for Rishi Sunak to come out on the steps of the Conservative Party's headquarters to speak to them gathered there. He's already been speaking to Tory MPs inside the Commons behind closed doors. We know he got a rapturous reception inside that meeting, and he told the MPs there will not be an early general election. With me, our chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley. So, Nick, we're going to hear from him shortly, we think.
Yeah, Jake Berry, the Conservative chairman, there waiting for the new Conservative leader, because he is in that post already, Rishi Sunak, to arrive at the party's headquarters just over the road from Parliament. I'm guessing that if Mr Sunak is turning up publicly, he's likely to say something publicly, given that we've not heard from him in public since, in terms of policy anyway, since the leadership election that he lost, the one a few weeks ago. We've not heard him as part of this leadership election either. He will want to, I would have thought, set out some views to the country. You can see just behind Jake Berry there some of the MPs who have been supporting Mr Sunak over the last few days. I could see Nick Gibb there, the former schools minister. Just as I was figuring out who the rest were, we lost that picture there. But look, this is a really significant moment for Rishi Sunak. He thinks that he's been vindicated by what's happened over the last few weeks with the views he expressed over the summer. I'm hearing some cheers there. I wonder if that could be for someone else. I think that's Alex Chalk, the former Solicitor General, being cheered there, one of the ministers who resigned, helping to bring down Boris Johnson a few weeks ago. But you can see there a number of Mr Sunak's supporters gathered, MPs who've been lobbying for him over the last few weeks. Someone a bit stressed there, getting a bit of a massage on their back. I think Alex Chalk was there. It's strange actually, because the Conservative Party's been so febrile. There's a lot of people standing there smiling just now, and you do get a bit of a sense, chatting to Tories on WhatsApp over the past couple of hours, that they feel there's a bit of a weight being lifted from their shoulders. You can see the former Scottish Secretary, David Mundell, there, some of Mr Sunak's other backers, all waiting for him to arrive at Conservative HQ in Westminster, presumably to address them. Liam Fox, the former Defence Secretary, in the bottom left there.
And when you say that you're getting a sense that a weight has been lifted off the shoulders, I mean, how important is it potentially for Tory party unity, or at least unity of the MPs, that this has happened in the way that it has, that there hasn't been another divisive contest?
Well, look, I suspect what you'll hear over the next 48 hours is two very different accounts of what's just happened. One will be opposition parties who will say these guys were behind Liz Truss just 7 weeks ago when she became Prime Minister. They backed her and they can't be trusted with the economy now. You'll hear from Mr Sunak and from his allies and from some of the MPs we can see on screen outside Conservative HQ just now. You will hear from them an argument that this is a chance to turn things around and to get things right. I suspect they will try and pass off what's happened over the last few weeks as a bad dream, but that won't be easy, because actually what Mr Sunak is going to have to address when he becomes Prime Minister, probably formally tomorrow, he will have to address an economic situation which most people accept has been made a lot worse by the mini-budget a few weeks ago, by some of the decisions that Liz Truss took. Yes, globally there are big economic challenges which have made it more difficult for the UK economy, but the vast majority of MPs you can see on your screen just now, they would argue that what happened over the last few weeks in here has made things more difficult as well. That's why Liz Truss was forced from office. That's why Rishi Sunak is about to take over in number 10. That's why he faces an enormous challenge over the next few weeks. Really difficult challenges, a daunting entry to try and turn the economy around, to try and persuade the electorate that the Conservatives can still be trusted with the economies. There are many Conservatives who would tell you privately that that's going to be a massive uphill struggle. Opposition parties like Labour will continue to say over the next few days that the Conservatives have lost their reputation for fiscal management.
Yeah, and we heard Labour saying they are now the party of fiscal responsibility.
So we wait for Rishi Sunak to arrive at Conservative HQ. It's not very far from Parliament, so he's not got far to go. So hopefully we'll be hearing from him soon. It's just over the road from the Houses of Parliament, behind Methodist Central Church in England. In London. It is, though, for the Conservative Party, a moment where the hope will be, the hope of the people we can see lining the steps there, will be that the party can start to move on and try and turn things around both politically and economically. But both of those things, Joanna, are going to be extremely difficult for the Conservative Party. Politically, because I suspect there will be a lot of people watching at home just now wondering why Mr Sunak can be in this position without a general election. There will be opposition figures who I expect will argue a lot over the next 24 hours that this needs to go to the country now. Economically, it will be challenging as well, because as we've been covering over the last few weeks on BBC News, this is a really testing economic time. A lot of people are facing higher mortgage rates. There's a big decision for the Bank of England next week about how much it's going to put interest rates up by. And there's that massive moment which is due to take place a week today, where the new Chancellor, if it's Jeremy Hunt who remains in that job, we should get confirmation over the next 24 hours. He will set out to the country how he intends to balance the books, and that will mean difficult spending decisions, probably cuts that will be very unpopular, potentially tax rises too.
And in terms of the personnel in this new government, you say that Jeremy Hunt, obviously Chancellor, and it is expected he'll stay, but we don't know, not confirmed.
I think there's a sense that that's likely.
Yeah, what about other figures?
Well, look, I think Rishi Sunak will want his own team in there, so I would expect there to be a lot of changes at the cabinet table. Remember that Liz Truss brought in mostly her allies, her fellow travellers, the ones who agreed with her on her economic direction. Given that Mr Sunak doesn't, I'd expect to see quite a few changes. But I'd also expect to see, given what's happened over the last few weeks with the Conservative Party, given what we've heard Mr Sunak told the 1922 committee just after being elected, I think we're likely to see a slightly more diverse cabinet when it comes to different wings of the Conservative Party than we saw under Liz Truss, and actually than we saw under Boris Johnson when he took over. Some names that potentially could be in line for big jobs are Dominic Raab, the former Deputy Prime Minister, who has been out to bat for Rishi Sunak in the last few days, but did the same even when the going got tough in the last leadership election.
We saw Matt Hancock there. Would he be hoping for a return to government?
I suspect he will be hoping for it. Whether it happens or not will be another question, one that Mr Sunak will be weighing up. One thing I was told by his team this morning is they've not been having conversations with MPs about who would take jobs, because they were concentrating so much on the votes today that they just wanted to get that out of the way, and they weren't being presumptuous. But they will be thinking about it. They will be thinking who they want in those top offices of state. In the Chancellor job, do they keep Jeremy Hunt? My hunch is that for stability reasons, that is likely. Who do they want as Home Secretary? Grant Shapps is in there just now, having been there for, 4 or 5 days now, but he is a Rishi Sunak backer. I wonder if his campaign might be tempted to keep him there. Will they want to change the Foreign Secretary? It's James Cleverly at the moment, someone who backed Liz Truss in the last leadership election, who backed Boris Johnson in this one, who said this morning that he was now backing Mr Sunak. But there are a lot of names in the mix. There are a lot of allies of Mr Sunak who batted for him over summer, even when it was a bit challenging and it was pretty clear that Ms Truss was going to win. I would have my eye on a lot of them potentially walking up this famous street tomorrow to be given jobs in his top team.
Because you have to be careful about that thing that has been criticised by some within the party about the politicians being promised something to back, in order to favour being carried by promising jobs.
Yes, I think he does have to watch out for that, and I think it's a more complicated picture now because of the need to reunite the Conservative Party. You can see a lot of people standing to attention, which suggests to me that we might be seeing the new Prime Minister-elect arriving at Conservative Party HQ any second. I think that's his car just pulling up. The new Prime Minister likely to be in that car, I think.
Yep, they're walking forward. Looks like it.
And there we are just now. Big cheer, presumably, for Rishi Sunak. There he is, the new Prime Minister, hugging some of his key allies, shaking hands there with the Conservative chairman, Jake Berry. Alex Chalk, former Solicitor General, getting a hug there as well. Mr Sunak looks like he's going in the door without addressing the public just yet. As we've been talking about all afternoon, this is a strange moment actually where we're seeing the new Prime Minister. We know he's spoken to Conservative MPs behind closed doors, but we've not heard anything from him in the last few days publicly, apart from statements posted on social media. There's a great deal of pressure on him actually to say something. There he is waving to the assembled crowd. A nice photo opportunity for the new Prime Minister. But there is a great deal of pressure, I think, on him now to say something, to tell the nation what he intends to do, what his guiding principles will be, perhaps to deliver a bit more clarity on what his policies will be. We will get some of that from him, I expect, tomorrow, if that's the day that he formally takes over as Prime Minister. As I say, there he is, into Conservative Party HQ.
Very quickly gone in.
No words just yet.
It's a good moment, isn't it, to take stock and think about what will be going through his mind, because as you're saying there is just so much on the agenda. But the fact is, when he lost that leadership contest only 7 weeks ago, he could have been out into the political wilderness for some time. It is extraordinary, and I wonder what he's thinking as so soon after his political fortunes are completely changed and he comes back as Prime Minister. And only over the weekend there was the talk around, whether Boris Johnson wanted to do a deal with him, presumably, again, not to see him coming in as Prime Minister.
I think you're absolutely right. And until early last week, when it became clear that the wheels were falling off on the Truss premiership, Rishi Sunak was out in the political wilderness. He wasn't someone that we expected to make an imminent return to frontline politics. He was deliberately keeping his head down. And from what I understand, his team, when Ms Truss announced her resignation, got going pretty quickly on lobbying MPs, realised that there was a groundswell of support for him, and we saw that this morning. A comfortable majority of MPs had declared publicly that they would back him, so I think he has a decent chance of getting the Conservative Party in Parliament on side. But there is still that wider question: is the Conservative Party membership going to be happy with Mr Sunak? Are they going to be happy with the decisions he makes over the next few weeks? And what about the country? It's 2019 was the general election. That's now, by this time tomorrow, that'll be 2 Prime Ministers ago. It was Boris Johnson who went to the country, promised to get Brexit done, won a majority on that basis. We've had Liz Truss since. the chaotic premiership that ended in disaster. Now we've got Mr Sunak preparing to take over. He will face questions about the mandate he has and whether he can take the country forward. The argument I suspect he will make is that there needs to be stability and there needs to be a bit of time for calm to allow the economy to get back on track. I'm guessing by the fact we're seeing a lectern in Conservative HQ that we are going to hear from Mr Sunak after all at some point. The microphones, I think, are the giveaway there, yes. Joanna. And look, well, this is the moment we were just talking about a few minutes ago. Rishi Sunak's chance to tell the nation, to tell the party membership what he wants to do with power, what his guiding principles will be, how he intends to get the economy back on track, how he intends to help people through the cost of living crisis. A really big moment for a man who a week ago looked like he was going to be in the political wilderness for some time.
Stay with us, we're going to keep an eye on that podium because we did just see him go into that building. We are clearly going to be hearing from him shortly. We'll be back there as soon as he starts to speak, but while we keep an eye on those pictures, let's also get some reaction from outside London. Michelle Kazi is a young South Asian who voted for Rishi Sunak 7 weeks ago in the last Conservative leadership race. Welcome. Well, did you expect that you'd be seeing him as Prime Minister so soon after that leadership contest went in a very different direction?
Well, while I didn't expect it, I must say I am beyond delighted that he is our Prime Minister. He's a very pragmatic Conservative. He knows and understands the economy, and I think he is the right man to tackle inflation and prevent us from going into recession.
I mean, you're obviously happy that it's Rishi Sunak, but what are your thoughts on the fact it didn't go to the wider party vote?
Honestly, I could have seen a wider party vote get quite messy very quickly. In a way, I'm glad that it's been resolved so quickly, because one of the issues was the fact that we don't have emails for everyone who's a member of the party. Now, there would have been a chance that perhaps thousands would have been excluded from this process. So the MPs resolving it this quickly is a good thing, because that means we don't get those logistical, technical issues of everyone getting a vote.
Does it matter to you that he is the first Prime Minister of colour, the first Prime Minister of Asian descent in this country?
I think it's something to be very proud of. We're a nation of aspiration, and to someone like me who's a first-generation migrant, it's something that makes me incredibly happy, because this shows that the UK is one of the most welcoming countries in the world for everyone, and Rishi Sunak proves that.
And it is Diwali, and when he was Chancellor, he lit Diwali candles outside the door at number 11. He said that was one of the proudest moments, actually, for him of his political career. He can potentially now do that outside number 10.
Yes, for everyone celebrating Diwali, I'd say we now have two reasons to celebrate. One is Diwali itself, and now Rishi being the PM.
He is, of course, though, going to face very difficult challenges facing the people of this country, and people individually having to make very difficult decisions. How difficult do you think that's going to make his premiership?
Well, what he's demonstrated with getting the nominations is showcasing to MPs and members he can unite the parliamentary party. I think that was the first challenge for anyone going into this leadership contest. Now he needs to just make sure he keeps them united, and I think he'll need to make all sides of the party happy when he's appointing his cabinet. So I will be pretty keen to see who is on his cabinet, because one of the mistakes Liz Truss made was she only had her allies in the cabinet. That just means you're opening up grounds for a potential revolt. So I would hope Rishi keeps all sides of the party happy, and then also reaches out to the wider membership as regularly as he can, because at the end of the day, members didn't have a vote, so they do need to be kept happy in this process.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Michelle Kazi. Well, we can talk now to Simon Kidwell, who's Vice President of the National Association of Head Teachers, and that union is warning today that 90% of schools are going to run out of cash next year. It comes obviously with the government facing serious questions about how to fix the black hole in public spending. I think we're talking to Simon Kidwell. Yes, we are talking to Simon Kidwell. So, Simon Kidwell, hello. Thank you for joining us. In terms of your concerns around what's happening with funding for schools, how worried are you?
We're incredibly worried at school because we are facing a black hole in the finances. In the 2019 manifesto, the Conservative government promised an uplift in funding that would restore real terms funding back to 2010 levels, and we were encouraged by the amount invested in education. However, we're now facing a £2 billion shortfall in that amount, which is equivalent to 38,000 teachers. So I am encouraged. I heard from Miriam Cates earlier on BBC News saying that Rishi Sunak was going to unite the party by returning to 2019 manifesto promises, and I'd urge him to make sure that education promised in 2019 is prioritised.
Has that already, though, been superseded in terms of what's happening with inflation?
I think the challenge is that schools faced real-term cuts throughout the last decade of 9%. That was then restored, to be restored by the end of this Parliament. So we're looking at a 3% cut in real terms funding by the end of this Parliament. If you look at private schools, they've had a 24% uplift in their real terms funding. So schools have no where to go apart from either making mass staff redundancies or increasing class sizes. We really are in a challenging position in schools.
Simon Kidwell, thank you for joining us. Well, how would you describe Rishi Sunak in one word? Savanta Comres, a polling research company, came up with a word cloud and people sent in their thoughts. And this is the conclusion. Rich is the overwhelming word alongside capable, OK, good and clever. Chris Hopkins is political research director at Savanta Comres, and he joins us live from Colchester. Welcome. So some words that people associate with Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Rich is going to grab the headlines here. Ultimately, it is the most eye-catching word on the page. But I think it's really important to remember that this is, when we ask these about almost any leader or any candidate that we've asked them about previously, it's rarely this good. The fact that capable, okay, good, clever, smart are all very, very readable on this image is really important and actually, a pretty good sign, a pretty good start for Rishi Sunak. I think the concern, obviously, is what the largest word is, and given the economic outlook that the UK faces at the moment, ultimately Rishi Sunak may well be seen to be slightly out of touch. Obviously, he is a very wealthy. It's well documented how wealthy he is, and whether he is therefore the person to lead Britain through troubling economic times when so many will struggle, that does remain to be seen. But yeah, I guess in that sense, it's not the greatest word to be dominating this word cloud.
He's got the leadership through effectively a coronation. How important do you think that is going to be?
I mean, I think generally speaking, the public are not that impressed. They weren't that impressed when Liz Truss came to power that way. But ultimately, it does happen increasingly a lot. And the UK is a parliamentary democracy. Therefore, this can happen. We do see in our polling, we have done for quite a while now, especially since Liz Truss became Prime Minister. But I'm sure calls will intensify now given that a second Prime Minister has been coronated, so to speak, without a general election. I'm sure calls for an election will increase, but ultimately, for Conservative MPs at the moment, given how far behind they are in the polls, that would be like turkeys voting for Christmas. And I think Rishi Sunak has already ruled out an immediate general election today. So yeah, I don't think the calls for that are, however intense.
Unity and how the party can move forward. Of course, that's going to be a challenge. We've seen quite a lot of division over the last few months over that summer leadership contest. Now we've got the man who lost that now in charge. So that's going to be quite a shift for the party to get behind. Now, those I've spoken to in Central Lobby have said that yes, they think that can be done. I was speaking earlier to Miriam Cates, as you saw, and she was saying she's the MP for Penistone and Stocksbridge, and she was saying that she felt a lot of the disagreement had been about personalities rather than policies. But of course, policies is going to be a key thing too, isn't it? And we're going to have to find out in the coming days what Rishi Sunak's policy platform is.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you very much. Let's go to Northamptonshire and our news correspondent,
when we've got
Joe Black. No, we don't have Joe. Let's bring in us here in Downing Street. We're waiting to hear from. Sorry, it's a bit of a whirl, isn't it? There's so much going on, and we are expecting to. Yes, we're expecting to hear from Rishi Sunak shortly.
Yeah, we're going to hear from him in Conservative H quarters in Westminster. I'm expecting a statement on from the Prime Minister-elect about his plans for office, his big guiding principles. I don't think there are any journalists in there, so I wouldn't expect there to be any questions when we hear from Mr Sunak at that podium in the next few minutes' time. But look, as we've been talking about all afternoon, it's a big moment because this hasn't been the normal campaign where ideas are tested, where there's a bit of a debate about what the right policies are. We had that over the summer, and Mr Sunak was part of that, so we know a bit about what he wants to do. But a lot of the economic situation since then has changed. Clearly, it's got worse. Clearly, there are going to have to be harder decisions made. And the big question for Mr Sunak when he addresses the nation for the first time since being elected Conservative leader and Prime Minister-elect is, does he level with the public and just say, look, the next few months are going to be hard. We're going to have to make some difficult decisions. That's exactly the message coming out of the Treasury, so I would expect Mr Sunak, as a former Chancellor, to know that picture and to feel the need to deliver a similar sort of statement. But it is a big moment for him politically, that he needs to tell us all what he wants to do with power.
And of course, Liz Truss remains in Downing Street behind us. But away from the cameras, we won't presumably see anything from her until we have that moment when she goes to see the King, and we don't know currently when that will be.
I think that's right. We will probably see that tomorrow. My understanding is the logistics of getting it done today are just too much, so we're not going to see that transition moment today, but we are likely to see it happen tomorrow. Mr Sunak is spending the afternoon, as we're seeing just now, at Conservative H quarters in central London, where he's meeting his supporters and speaking to them, and he's about to address the nation for the first time as Conservative leader. But I mean, tomorrow is the moment, the kind of history moment, where Rishi Sunak will formally become Prime Minister, where we will see Liz Truss walk out of number 10 for the first time as the shortest serving Prime Minister in British history. She will try and put a brave face on it and say, here's what I think we've done in power. She tried that last week where she talked about reducing national insurance. That's about it, really. She will then go to see the King, and for the first time he will be at the centre of that process, where he will welcome Liz Truss, accept her resignation, then invite Rishi Sunak to form a new government. He will then come back here to Downing Street and make that address to the country from outside number 10. But as we can see at the moment, he is in Westminster, just opposite the Houses of Parliament, where his supporters have been gathering. You can see some of them on screen now, clapping away, clearly very happy that their man has got the top job. He is in that building at the moment, and we're about to hear him weeks was facing the turmoil of the pandemic, that extraordinary intervention that Mr Sunak had to oversee, the furlough scheme, the business support, hundreds of billions of pounds spent on propping up the British economy at a time of crisis in the health world. Well, now Mr Sunak is about to take over in number 10 at a time of crisis in the economy, and he is facing probably a similar sort of level of challenge when it comes to getting inflation under control, getting government spending under control, trying to fill the fiscal black hole, and trying to help millions of people across the country who are struggling with the cost of living crisis. His entry is daunting, and he faces big challenges as Prime Minister.
Thank you, Nick. Well, let's go to Northamptonshire and our news correspondent, Joe Black in Corby. Joe.
Hi, yes, we've been talking to voters here in Corby in Northamptonshire, which is 90 miles away from where you are in Westminster, talking to them about the fact that Rishi Sunak is the new Prime Minister. I have to say, not many people were surprised, but some people said, you know, that's just the way it is. That's just politics. So we asked them what they wanted from their new Prime Minister. You won't be surprised to learn that lots of them wanted him to focus on the economy. Cost of living was another one. Someone said to me, we spoke to a young teacher who was in his 20s. He said he can't afford a mortgage. Friends of his can't afford a mortgage. He doesn't know what he's going to do when his friend moves out of his rented property. So cost of living, living places, really on people's minds around here. Spoke to one lady who said she just wanted stability. She talked about how she was retired and she had investments and she wanted Rishi to look after the economy because of that. She said working people have got these investments, so that's what she wanted him to focus on. She wanted him to bring the party together. Stability, a big word around here. Also been struck by how many people here are fans of Boris Johnson. Lots of them have told me that they're very disappointed that he stepped away from the contest. And also, it might not surprise you, lots of people around here still calling for a general election.
Thank you very much, Joe. Well, that is something that Rishi Sunak has said will not be happening. But in order for it not to happen, there needs to be political unity, political stability. And he's been speaking to his Tory MPs in private. We're expecting to hear from him speaking in front of the cameras. He went into Conservative Party headquarters just a little bit earlier. He didn't speak on camera. We saw him go into the building fairly quickly, but there was a throng of his supporters outside, and there was lots of cheering and handshaking. No words in front of the cameras, but we are expecting to hear from him shortly. Nick Eardley here with me in Downing Street as we await that, Nick. And it is going to be obviously the first time that we hear him speak since being declared Prime Minister, unchallenged. Well, there was the challenge, but didn't go to the vote in the end. How much detail would you expect him to give?
Not much. I don't think he'll go into specific policies. I think this will be a broad outline, a thanks to his campaign, probably, a bit of a message to the Conservative Party and a message to the country saying these are the broad principles that will guide his politics. It's normally that moment here in Downing Street where a Prime Minister outlines a bit more of their big grand vision for power. But my sense is that what Mr Sunak has to say will be dictated by the economy, will be dictated by what's happened with the cost of living crisis, rather than any grand vision of broader political ambition. Mr Sunak will know that people are worried about the economic climate. He will know how close to the breadline a lot of households are at the moment, and I suspect that's something that he will feel that he has to address over the next few minutes. It will be a statement, is my understanding. I'm not expecting any questions from journalists, so the scrutiny of his policies may have to wait for today. But this is his first moment as Conservative leader to stand up to the nation and say, here's what I want to do. And it will be tomorrow, I expect. I don't think it's been formally confirmed just yet, but I would expect it to be tomorrow that we get the transition of power here, where Liz Truss leaves for the last time and the new Prime Minister Rishi Sunak arrives back in Downing Street. Remember, it's only a few weeks ago that he lived in number 11, not that long ago that he resigned from Boris Johnson's government, but he'll be moving into number 10 for the first time. But shortly, we're expecting a slightly ominous black screen just come up there. But shortly, we are expecting Rishi Sunak to make his first comments, in public anyway, since he became the Prime Minister-elect.
And, I mean, you talk obviously about the in-tray. There are, in terms of the challenges, there are always challenges, obviously, for any Prime Minister, but in terms of how much they stack up right now, it's a particularly difficult time, isn't it? Because it's the problems with the country, with those choices to be taken on how to provide support for people when the economy is already shrinking, the need to cut public spending, and then juggling, of course, the internal politics of it all.
It's a colossal challenge. I think we have a rough idea from the summer of Rishi Sunak's sort of guiding principles. So he wants to bring inflation down. He wants to try and keep the economy growing, but without taking radical decisions like Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng did. But he's also made it pretty clear in his previous statements, we'll see if these hold over the next few days, that he wants interventions to be targeted. He doesn't want to do what Liz Truss did when she came in, which is throw money at a problem. She looked at that energy issue, the cost of energy, and said, we need to have a medium-term solution. She offered to cap the price of energy, the unit price, for 2 years. Well, that fell apart, and the new Chancellor ripped that up. That guarantee is only there for 6 months now. Could mean that some on better incomes are facing higher bills in the next few months.
The calls won't go away from opposition politicians, obviously, of the need, they say, for a general election. Rishi Sunak has said that there won't be one. What would you say are the prospects now of whether there is an earlier election? Have they receded a bit by the fact that he has come in the way that he's come in, with the party uniting behind him?
I think they're low for the simple reason that you need Conservative MPs to back it, and at the moment it would be a lot like turkeys voting for Christmas, because all the polls suggest that the Conservatives would get hammered if there was a general election tomorrow. We are going to see a lot of people over the next few days say
Do we? Where does he stand on Ukraine, defence? Where does he stand on foreign policy?
Well, he took quite hawkish positions on Ukraine in the leadership election that we had during the summer. He's always said he supported the government's position on Ukraine, and I think that's right. But one of my worries about him is that he is quite a treasury man,
yes,
a numbers man,
yes,
if you like.
A details man.
A details man, and some people do worry about the cost of the Ukraine war.
Yeah.
I don't think Boris Johnson or Liz Truss did really. They thought the absolute first priority was to give Ukraine what it needed in its fight with Putin. There are some people who are nervous that will Sunak be quite the same person. And what I'm looking for, the next big step we all need to look at is the kind of cabinet that he builds. Liz Truss's big mistake was she only really put her supporters in place.
Yes.
I'm hoping that he will put it's been a long time, it's true of under Boris Johnson as well, it's true under Liz Truss, we haven't had our best people, our biggest beasts in the front line jobs. If he really does form a cabinet of all the talents, then I think that will give me, other Conservatives, markets, the people of Britain, the reassurance that I think we all hope for.
So Jeremy Hunt will remain at the Treasury, you believe?
I hope so.
And Ben Wallace at Defence?
Well, that's perhaps the biggest question in the formation of the new cabinet. There's been a debate within British politics about whether defence expenditure should move from about 2% of GDP to 3%. That's something that Liz Truss promised, it's something Jeremy Hunt promised, it's something Boris Johnson promised. And I think Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, regards himself as the guardian of that policy. Now, I think Rishi Sunak inherits very difficult public finances, and I'm not sure he will give the level of commitment that Ben Wallace wants. If Ben Wallace walks, that will be worrying for lots of us who want a hawkish position on Ukraine.
Okay, and just on the Foreign Office, a lot of people talking about Penny Mordaunt as a way of folding her in. She seems qualified for that position, presumably.
Yes, I think she definitely deserves a considerable role in the Conservative Party. I personally would like to see perhaps someone like Tom Tugendhat. He's the current Security Minister, he used to chair the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, former military man. I think he's probably better suited to that role. I don't think Rishi Sunak did do deals with Penny Mordaunt or anyone else. I hope not. But she wouldn't be my first choice for one of those top 3 or 4 jobs.
And the other big job, of course, Home Office.
Yes, and that's another big issue for Rishi Sunak in terms of his governance of the Conservative Party. The majority of the Conservative Party want a much stricter policy on immigration, for example, which comes under the Home Office remit. But Rishi Sunak and perhaps the Treasury see advantages for economic growth, allowing more immigrants into the economy. It will make some of their budgetary decisions potentially easier. But in potentially going down that route of relaxing immigration controls, they'll be taking a different stance from what most Tory members want, and certainly what the Tory tabloids want as well.
We're hoping to hear from him any moment now, really. Let's talk about his style, because he's been accused of being aloof and out of touch. He's obviously wealthy, but he's also had this elite education as well, hasn't he? How easy is he going to be to relate to in the way, that was obviously Boris Johnson's great ability, wasn't it? He also came from this very privileged background, but he had this great personable touch.
Yeah. Well, Boris Johnson, you almost answered your own question in a way.
But Rishi Sunak, is he able to make that connection?
Well, that is a good question, and I think the British people largely are fair-minded. I don't think they judge people necessarily from their background if they portray an evidence and understanding of people's real problems. On the face of it, it could be difficult. One of the richest, some people say Rishi Sunak is the richest person to have ever been in the Parliament behind us. And of course
I'm going to pause there just because he's speaking now. We'll get your idea of it.
I'd like to pay tribute to Liz Truss for her dedicated public service to the country. She has led with dignity and grace through a time of great change and under exceptionally difficult circumstances, both at home and abroad. I am humbled and honoured to have the support of my parliamentary colleagues and to be elected as leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party. It is the greatest privilege of my life to be able to serve the party I love and give back to the country I owe so much to. The United Kingdom is a great country, but there is no doubt we face a profound economic challenge. We now need stability and unity, and I will make it my utmost priority to bring our party and our country together, because that is the only way we will overcome the challenges we face and build a better, more prosperous future for our children and our grandchildren. I pledge that I will serve you with integrity and humility, and I will work day in, day out to deliver for the British people.
Okay, that was Rishi Sunak, the incoming Prime Minister. Looked quite stilted.
A little bit stilted, I think. But
What did you think about the content?
I think it overall struck the right note. I think there was a note of grace to his predecessor.
Yes, tribute to Liz Truss.
Not many people have said very nice things about Liz Truss for a little while. I think his big challenge is I think he's got the goodwill of people, but the Conservative Party is quite a divided party.
Yes.
There are lots of people who don't want him as Prime Minister. I think being generous to his opponents, being generous to his critics, as he did there with Liz Truss, is incredibly important.
No need to mention Boris there, presumably.
Well, he mentioned Boris on Twitter last night, so perhaps that was that's a box ticked.
Humbled and honoured. He talked about the profound economic challenge. So, you know, setting out his stall straight away, that's the priority.
Absolutely. The challenge, I think, as well as the economy, though, will be for him to reassure the Tory right, who are most suspicious of him, on issues like immigration, on migrants crossing the channel, which is a big issue in British politics, and also, for example, the environmental protesters in Britain at the moment that keep stopping motorways and others functioning. He also needs to be the law and order candidate. Those, I think, will be his two priorities in office.
But that's the issue, isn't it? We just don't know where he stands on any of it. He's talked a bit about immigration. He's got quite a tough line on immigration, hasn't he?
Well, he took very tough positions during the Tory leadership election in the summer. Some of us didn't know whether he was taking those positions in order to win votes with members, or that's what he genuinely believed. Well, the tea bag, there's an expression sort of, you only know the strength of a tea bag until it's in hot water. Well, he's now in the hot water of the challenges Britain faces, and we'll begin to find out who the real Rishi Sunak is.
Around the world, the headlines, you know, take different contexts. A lot of people making a point about him being the first Prime Minister of colour in this country. Is that important, do you think, for this nation as well? Or just the outside looking in?
Max, I think the most important thing about it is that it almost isn't important.
Yes.
You know, I've not heard, well, I actually had one or two people on the radio yesterday sort of slightly
It hasn't been a big talking point, has it?
It's sort of, it's natural.
Yes.
And it's almost become natural that we recently had our third female Prime Minister, and it wasn't the fact that people of colour, women are becoming arriving to the top of British politics in other walks of life. The fact that it's becoming commonplace, almost unremarkable. We have the most ethnically diverse cabinet over the last few years. The fact that we're no longer judging people by the colour of their skin or their gender, but by the content of their character, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, and by their ability. That's the thing I think we should most celebrate.
He hasn't often talked about it, but there was an interview he did talk about it, and he would talk about, he was brought up in Southampton, wasn't he? And he'd talk about he'd go to the temple every weekend, but he'd also go and watch the football every weekend, and that's how he contextualised his growing up.
Yeah, well, football is one of the great uniters in British. We call it football, not soccer, unlike the Americans. And it is one of the great uniters. And when he was Chancellor, he famously lit candles outside number 11 Downing Street, the residence of the Chancellor, to mark Diwali. And it would be lovely seeing the British Prime Minister potentially do that in the next day or two.
OK, Tim Montgomery, really thank you for joining us on this really historic day in British politics. We've had a few this year, but it's certainly one of them. The whirlwind contest in the UK was staged after Liz Truss announced last week that she was quitting the top job, becoming the shortest-serving Prime Minister in British history. CNN looking at what led to her downfall as well. For more insight, do go to our website, cnn.com, or find it on your CNN app. We'll be back in a moment.
time anyway. BBC leaving?
That would be bad.
Oh, Adrian.
Make up an auto cue. I've got to be on the TV. I don't think it's that much better.
I don't know if I'll need it. If they're going to move, then it'll be fine, I think. So, gonna...
They have to move.
Yeah. Well, you say that. Oh, is it? Okay. I trust you.
Is that a standby? Just give me a heads up to stay close.
It's nice and dark.
They can turn it around really easily anyway. There we go.
Celine's going to come up first, next car, and I'll push back and then we'll get to the shot, okay?
Perfect, thank you. Okay, get them to go now.
to know that he's coming now.
Oh, you're a star.
Thank you. He's coming.
Get your cameras ready, guys.
That's not him. Nope.
好，各位观众，参选英国地区领导人的保守党民意代表领袖摩丹特宣布退选，同样角逐大位的前财务部门负责人苏纳克自动成为新的英国地区领导人。负责领导人选举事务的保守党团1922委员会20日宣布选举新规则，有意争取地区领导人一职的党籍民意代表需获至少100位民意代表提名，24日下午2时截止。若至当天下午2时只仅有1人达100人提名门槛，则此人将自动成为地区领导人，不需一般党员投票确认。摩丹特当地时间近下午2时宣布退选。1922委员会主席布雷迪随后宣布苏纳克成为新的英国地区领导人。摩丹特发布声明指出，很清楚，党内认为今天就该尘埃落定。他宣布全力支持苏纳克，并指出苏纳克的当选不仅显示保守党做出历史性决定，更再次展现保守党的多元性与人才济济。苏纳克今天上午即获超过半数同党国会议员公开表态支持。保守党国会议员总计有357位，半数为179人。至今天下午1时45分，英国广播公司指出，苏纳克已获超过190位同僚支持。 保守党地区领导人选举规则不固定，由1922委员会与保守党委员会依次商议而定。现行党章赋予一般党员投票选出新地区领导人的权利。我们将会持续为你追踪现场的最新情况，感谢你的收看。